Good morning. We'll be starting here in about 3 minutes. Check my clock. Yep. Couple more minutes and we'll get started. Just giving time for folks to log in. Grab yourself a cup of Joe and settle back and ready for the next hour. And while you're logging in, if you want, you can go ahead and open up your chat pod and your Q&A pod and get ready to use your hands. And we'll go from there. And you can log in to polyv.com, look for David Orr PE, or download the app. We'll be using all three today. One more minute and we'll go ahead and get started because we know some folks log on at the very last minute. Okay, so top of the hour, I'll give folks about 30 seconds to start, and then we'll go ahead and get going with today's webinar. Okay, good morning, and welcome to our penultimate webinar for our winter season or early spring season or whatever we want to call this weather right now. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the New York State LTAP Center, part of the Cornell Local Roads program. And today we're going to be talking about essentially revenue sources. And we say grant, state aid, federal aid, and other sources, but we are going to spend some time talking about your local aid because obviously everything comes into play. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. As I said, this is the penultimate of our foundational webinars, but we have a special webinar coming up this Thursday on grant writing, which ties right into getting funding. That's being taught by the director of the Ohio LTAP Center, Victoria Beal, and definitely is worth coming over to see. Then we're going to be taking a break with our webinars because we're going to be doing our workshop season, and we're going to be doing our summer webinars starting up after highway school coming up in the middle of June. So look for those, sign up, but also we'd love to see at some of our workshops. We have workshops on budgeting and other things that could be very interesting and related again to today's webinar, but also topics on safety and roads in general. If you see a star, by the way, those are ones that we anticipate will be worth one professional development hour for continuing education. Not all of them are, because we have to follow the rules of the New York State Education Department. Now, just as a reminder for those who've not been on one of our webinars before, we're using Zoom. Bottom left corner, you can pull that up. You'll find audio settings if you have a sound issue. Please open up your chat pod. It's inactive for you to put things in, but it's a real important place for you to open up, because we'll put a link to our handouts, the polls, those things. Will give you messages that way, and a link to the grant writing webinar coming up on Thursday. We will ask you to raise your hands now and then. In fact, I'll do that here in just a couple of minutes. And then the Q&A is where you're going to be able to put in some questions that aren't part of one of the polls. And we'll get to the polls in a little bit. Now, a caveat and the handout. Again, if you open up the chat pod, the handout will be popped into that. But the caveat is the handout has on it some pretty cool stuff, things that we thought were useful sources of revenue. And here's the handout looking right there. It's not comprehensive. This is not even close to comprehensive. We're going to be talking a little bit about the federal infrastructure law, sometimes called bill, which I just like because it's got the nice logo with it. And yes, the QR code will take you to that link to download the handout as well. But the thing I want you to understand is we can't, in a foundational webinar in 1 hour, really cover everything. And when we talk about finding sources, I'll talk a couple of alternative places to look, because we really want to get you started to help fund your responsibilities. Okay, so we're going to start with talking a little bit about highway ownership and cost, because we are the local roads program, though we'll talk about other responsibilities as well. And then we'll really get into highway financing, sources of revenue, things like that. Now, to help me out, because I've got some places I can go left and right and things like that, let's do a little bit of fun and find out who's here. So who do you work for? And if you go to the Poll EV, you can put everything in for city, county, town, consultants, contractor, federal government or state government, the weekend. And if you can't access the polls, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I can just add that to the numbers in my head. Okay, so we have quite a few from cities and villages today, 7, 5 from counties, a couple of consultants, got 1 person who works for the weekend. That's good. And state or federal, and 1 town. Okay, so, and then over here on the Poll EV, we've got a blend, everything from cities and towns, state. Okay, cool. That helps me quite a bit. So a lot of city folks today and county folks. Okay. What is your job? Are you a highway superintendent or commissioner? Are you an engineer? You're a crew supervisor? You're an administrator? Somebody working in the office? Someone working in the field? You're a board member? Supervisors, you know, all the way down to just somebody working for the council. If you work for somebody else, none of the above, throw that in the chat pod so I can get a sense. For instance, we have somebody part of an intermunicipal organization. Those are very useful. And yes, you're eligible for a lot of the funds we'll talk about today. And then we have folks putting in highway superintendents and engineers. Okay, so about half engineers. Okay. And then finally, where are you from? This one you can actually click on the map and little boxes will pop up. So we'll see where folks are from today. And there's about 60 of you, a little more than 60 of you online right now. So, okay. Give folks a few seconds to get used to that. And again, pollev.com/DavidOrPE, all one word. Okay. So not too many from the North Country or down in the Western Southern Tier, interestingly enough. Okay, and we have somebody in the chat that said North Syracuse. Okay. So that helps me quite a bit. We'll get ahead and move on. Let's talk a little bit about highway ownership. Again, we could talk about infrastructure, but let's just look at highways and realize that about 3/4 of the mileage here in New York State is managed, maintained by local agencies, whether they are towns, counties, villages, or cities. The state has about 13%. There is actually, if I had put in non-municipal roads, there's a small wedge in there for New York State, which would include the thruway and some private roads that are still considered public or maintained by private organizations that are part of the inventory system. But this is the ones that are owned by municipalities. Okay. And again, if you open the chat pod, the polls, when they come up, will pop right in there, and it's pollev.com/DavidOrP. Okay. But the thing about it is we got to pay for these roads. So how much money do we have? Well, we're updating these numbers as we speak. We're downloading new data as we're coming out of COVID, but these are pre-COVID numbers. How much money we've got available, we talked quite a bit about this, but towns are spending about $14,000 per centerline mile. Counties and villages and cities quite a bit more, mostly because they have higher levels of service and other things that they have to deal with, wider roads, and we're only looking at center lines. And there's a range, of course, ranging from fairly low to fairly high. And if we plot this out, I'll just show the town map for the sake of time. You can see there's quite a bit of a range, just a few thousand all the way up to over 100,000 in a couple of cases down near New York City. But again, think about the traffic volume, think about the level of service, and multi-lane roads are going to cost more. But we got to pay for this one way or the other. And of course, when we look at small agencies, really we're dealing with high percentage of the budget is related to highway. This is a percentage of highway across the state. You can see some towns, it's above 90%. And even in urban areas, if you were to add in infrastructure, water, sewer, things like that, it's a pretty high percentage of what our costs are. So we've got to figure this out. So let's do a little exercise with PolEV, okay? We do this quite often, but it's really important to start here. What do you have to maintain? What are you responsible for the public? What kind of things are you responsible for? You're responsible for assets. So what kind of assets do you have? Safety of the public, maintenance, yep. City-owned operations, yeah. Okay, people are putting over in the Q&A, maintenance and safety. Okay. Storm drains, sewers, bridges, roads, streets. Okay. And so signs, yeah, I see that. Essentially, you're responsible for lots of things. And if we look at it from a hard side, most of your answers here are more general, but look at it from the hard side. You know, we've got signs, we've got snow and ice operations, we've got traffic control, we've got bridges and culverts and drainage, all of these responsibilities for the highway side of the house. But reality creeps in, especially I saw a lot of you were cities and counties, but even if you're with towns, we have a lot more responsibilities than just those roads and streets. We've got recycling, we've got the town hall and other buildings, we might have parks and cemeteries, a water and sewer department. Some agencies pick up the garbage or at least pick up leaves. And some even have electrical systems that they deal with, part of the power authority electricity that's available. So this was the list of responsibilities you put in based upon what we had done before. What I want you to do now, I'm going to clear the responses. And I want you to put in the things you're responsible for that are not roads and streets. So just put in things that are non-road and street that you might be responsible for, that you have to deal with. And whether it falls in the highway budget or not, that's a budgeting session. Yeah, buildings, crew safety. Yeah, buildings is going to be pretty popular, I suspected. Airport. Oh, somebody's got an airport. Some people have sewers, tree removal. Okay. Trails, train stations. Yeah. Transfer stations. Yeah. Just start thinking about all the things you've got to maintain, and we got to pay for all of this. So that's pretty important. Okay. And again, we could talk about where it fits in the budget in a different webinar or even in one of our budgeting workshops. But start making yourself a list, and then you got to figure out how you're going to pay for all of this. Now, it would be nice if we had all the money we needed to maintain these things at the level we'd like, okay? So we could maintain our art and we could maintain our cemeteries and everything. But we know the reality is not going to always allow us to do that. So let's look at local highway financing, okay? This is for towns, and again, I told you we're updating these data. And we figure this is a good time to do it as we're coming out of COVID, and we'll put something in one of our newsletters or up on the web when we get the data updated, and certainly update the workshop. But in 2014, this is the last year where we got every single town because people hadn't always put the data in. And the numbers haven't changed too much, even looking preliminarily at the data. But almost 90% of the highway financing here in New York State is with local dollars. And that's why I say we're going to spend some time talking about those local dollars. Because like it or not, there is no way we can get federal and state dollars to handle everything. We're going to have some local dollars. And the amount of money that's state is about 10%. Most of that, but not all, is CHIPS and its related kin. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, there is some federal dollars available. And while for towns, it's a small wedge of only 2% or so, a lot of you were cities and counties. And in the cases of counties, the federal wedge gets up an average of about 11, 12%. And cities is 7 or 8 was what it was before COVID. But we'll see what the numbers are as we come out of COVID. I always like to keep in mind, however we're dealing with, obviously you've heard me talk about drainage and communications, but who's our user? So who is using your roads and streets? So again, another poll EV, who's using your roads? The public, but who is the public? Think about that for a second. Pedestrians, absolutely. Okay, everyone. Okay. Pets, residents, farmers, trucks, yeah. Bicyclists, first responders. Yeah, we actually need roads for first responders. Yeah, and streets, schools, businesses, motorcycles. Funny, nobody's put down car yet. But just think about all the people that are using the roads and streets, and they have different needs. There's people who have some form of disability that you need to deal with, like the ADA. How do you get people to school? How do you get people to, the local sporting events? So think about all those users as you're developing it, and what level of service do you want to provide to those people? What level of service do they want? And that's that balancing act between, do they need a Cadillac or do they just need a Chevy? And so these are kinds of things we'll think about, and we'll talk a little bit when we talk about financing here in just a minute. And again, one way to look at this is to flip that number upside down. Look at highway cost, not by the cost per center line, but the cost per person. Okay. So look at the cost per person that you've got to deal with. Okay. Which ranges, again, from some places it's over $2,000 per person, down to literally under $79 for a whole year in a lot of municipalities because there's a large population. It almost flips it on its head. So we want to be judicious with how we spend the money that we're all being trusted with to manage our roads and streets and all those other things that are in our system, cemeteries and water systems and sewer systems, which would add, of course, some cost, and we'd have to think about that. So what I want to do is I want to sort of walk through the concepts, the sources of funding that exist. Okay. So we're going to start with local funding a little bit. Okay. And there's lots of local funds that we need to talk about. Then we'll talk a little bit about state funding, both state funding that's annual and other sources of state funding. We'll spend some time on federal funding. Okay. And somebody asked a question. I'm going to go back here because it's a good question. I just want you to be careful about the maps. The maps that you're looking at are general. Please don't get too specific. And if you're wondering why in this map you see little black sections, that's the cities. When you do a town map, that's not a city, so we make them black. Okay, and then the county outlines to show from there. So there's a city inside of a particular county. It'll just show up as black. We have city maps as well, if you're interested. We'll talk about federal funding, And then we'll talk a little bit about other sources, including the possibility of private funding or non-governmental funding. And borrowing money is actually a source of funding to pay for projects, not maybe a source of revenue, but it is a source of funding to make a project work. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Okay. So sources of revenue under the world of local, there might be state aid or federal aid. Private public partnerships is something you may have heard about. Um, and then grants, government, private, NGOs, things like that. And then finally, borrowing funds. Okay, so we'll talk about these things a little bit. But let's start with local revenue. What are your sources for your local revenue, whether you're with a county, city, town, or the state even? How does the state fund things? Taxes. Taxes, yeah, taxes is true. Okay. Chips, okay. Not local, that's a state revenue. I'm looking for local revenue. How does the local government fund things, not counting state aid, not counting any federal aid that they get? Taxes. But what kind of taxes? What kind of taxes are you getting? Well, saying bills for utilities, somebody put over in the Q&A, yeah. User fees are sometimes called, yeah. Especially for water and sewer. Sales tax, okay. So counties have sales tax, cities sometimes have things. There's revenue sharing in some cases, okay. There's property taxes. Property taxes is the largest share of our taxes by far, okay. Some local governments do have grants that they give out, usually to others, not themselves, okay. Permit fees, yeah, okay. Surplus sales can bring in some funds. Hotel residence tax, ooh, that's a real popular one, okay. Again, start thinking about these sources of funding, because again, they're going to be a high percentage of the real funding that you've got. So let's look at some of the more common taxes at the local level. There's usually a mortgage and or property tax. Property taxes being the largest share. That's certainly how schools do most of their funding. We already talked about sales tax a little bit. Very important to understand what you're actually getting for sales tax and why it's important to have a good economy, okay? A tourism tax, a bed tax, a hotel tax, people use different words for these things, but essentially you're getting money for people coming in and visiting areas, and New York State is filled with some extremely pretty areas and places that people like to visit as tourists. And as we're coming out of COVID, hey, hopefully people will start doing that in the same numbers again. You might get revenue from another municipality. You know, if you're snow plowing for another municipality, you might get some revenue. And you may go, well, it's a break even. At least make it break even. The goal is really to try to make sure you can pay for everything, that you're sustainable. Okay. A pilot is a payment in lieu of taxes. Here in Tompkins County, both the county and the city and some of the bus company get some money via pilots from the university. Today's not the day to discuss the amounts. It's really just the idea of, for those who are tax exempt, there is a way to do some funding in lieu of taxes. So I'm going to lower everybody's hands. I'm going to ask you, how many of your agencies have pilots within your community? And if you do, you could pop that in the Q&A on just to illustrate who you're getting the pilots from. And no one is fine. Okay, just a couple of you. Okay. It's fairly common with academic institutions, higher education. You'll see that quite often. Sometimes you'll see that with nonprofits when they set things up. There'll be a payment in lieu of taxes that can be put into play. Okay. And then, of course, there's fees. We already talked about fees collected for services, water, garbage. How much you're getting? Again, that's a balancing act. You are going to have some things covered by the taxes of property and mortgage and sales, but some could be done with services. And you could even use fees as a way to maybe help people recycle by having the fee for recycling zero or low and the fee for garbage be higher, and it pushes people in a different direction. Okay. Could be licensing fees, a lot of, licensing and, getting permits, things like that. And of course, this is one we don't think about too much. And from an overall municipal standpoint, I agree with you. It's not a change in the amount of revenue for the local agency, but interfund transfers are very important. For the highway department, if you're doing work that's not highway, we need to make sure that the right funds pay for the right work so that we can really do an apples to apples comparison. If you're doing work on the town garage or the town hall, that technically falls under the general fund. And so we need to make sure that we're paying for highway things with highway funds and general town or city or county with general funds. And those interfund transfers are really important just from management at the budget standpoint. And they act as a sort of funding, but not overall for the municipality. Okay. So these are things to think about for local funds, which again is going to be the majority of the money that you've got to manage your system. Okay. Now, sources of state aid. So let's pop in here some sources of state aid that you've got. Where have you gotten money from the state? Somebody put CHIPS down. We'll definitely talk about CHIPS. Okay. AIM, aid, that's essentially the sharing of funds. EWR, Emergency Winter Recovery. Ooh, okay. Grants, there's some grants that are out there. We'll talk about a couple of grants from the state. Bridge New York, Bridge New York is an interesting one. Bridge New York is actually federal for the bridges and state for the culverts, things 20 feet and under. We'll talk a little bit about Bridge New York in a little bit, but it's an interesting thing. It's a single program that actually has both federal in it and state. I'm looking for the state side of the house right now, things that you and I are supporting with our state taxes that go to the New York State, the Department of Transportation, or even other agencies within the state. Okay, so we're looking at state aid right now. Okay, and people have got grants. Okay, we'll come back to federal aid in a little bit. And somebody, by the way, asked about those maps. When we update those maps, we'll post them on our website with the updated numbers, and we'll let folks know about them. Okay, so watch this space, watch our website, watch our newsletter. We'll get those maps out to people. POP, oh yes, POP is a new one that's out there. We'll talk about POP. Rails to Trails, that could be federal or it could be state, and there's actually some funding for both. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the state aid side of the house. The most common for highway purposes, again, local roads program, is through the local programs bureau. So the 5 programs that are the ones that you probably have thought about the most, non-bridge, is CHIPS, which is nowadays it's called the Consolidated Local Street and Highway Improvement Program. It's had different names over the years. It was a Capital Highway Improvement Program and had maintenance things in it, but now it's still called CHIPS. So there's actually a company that called New York Chips. It makes potato chips flavored as different specialties around the state. So they have a Speedy's chip and a Dinosaur Barbecue chip. I haven't seen a Utica Greens chip yet, but I'm waiting. But they're pretty good chips. But the idea is think about chips as a major source of funding. There is a Pave New York program, which is available to help pave roads and do some things. But remember, that's just like CHIPS, it's for capital work. Okay. Extreme Winter Recovery has become almost an annual fund source, but it's all related, same model that's used for CHIPS in terms of how the monies go out. There's a new thing called the State Touring Route Program. For those of you who are with villages and cities especially, but even some counties, you may have a road in your municipality that's got a label that says state highway, but it's actually maintained by, and the work has to be done by, the municipality. So again, we'll ask you to raise your hand if you have a touring route within your community, within your village, within your city, that it says it's a state highway, but it's actually a city street or a village street or a county road. So we have a couple of you. I would definitely look at those state touring routes funds. Okay. Those monies actually have some ways they're available for non-state touring routes, but that's its primary purpose. And it was put in last year. So something you may want to look into. And then finally, there's Pave Our Potholes. That's actually a paving set of funds. It's not for patching, even though it's POP. We love our acronyms, made a nice acronym, but it's actually for paving operations, capital work above and beyond what you'd get for CHIPS. It's a more of a grant-based kind of thing you've got. Okay, so that's the most common things we think about. But I'm gonna go back to our poll. We have Pave New York and POP, and multimodal was one that somebody put in there. That's good. And some, again, it might be federal, might be state, but other places within the state where you've gotten money, maybe to pay for those things that aren't highway funds. We talked about all those other responsibilities. Is there state aid available to help maintain those cemeteries and water sewer systems, trails, things like that? Somebody put a rails to trails. There is some state funds, okay? Well, think about that, and we'll come back and revisit, and I'll give you some sources where you can find some state aid, okay? And by the way, if you're wondering where you can get the chips, local stores have them. Around here, we have Wegmans and Tops. I've seen them at both. I've seen them in the convenience stores nearby. I don't know which flavors they've got, but okay. Yes, there's some money through Preserving New York. There's education department funding. There's water funding through the Department of Health. And again, I'll talk a little bit about where you find these sources of funds. In an hour, we can't cover them all, but I can at least get you started thinking about where you could find, because there's actually quite a few sources out there, but most of them are competitive. So you have to compete with others, okay? Now, a couple that I'll bring up that I think are worthwhile is one we use. We actually get money through the Governor's Traffic Safety Committee for highway safety grants. They actually just released yesterday the announcement for this next cycle. And we have work zone packages that I'm a little behind on, but we'll be putting those out here in the next few weeks, where we're sending those out to municipalities to get them packages if they've had their work zone equipment damaged and destroyed. But they're used for everything from safety training and seatbelt programs and child safety seats and things like that. So that's a possibility. There's lots of things to look at. Don't assume there isn't state aid. Ask, but remember, we're not going to be able to grant our way out of the problem. We're really going to have to think about other alternatives. Here's one that actually is the Department of State. This is the City of Canandaigua, the Town of Canandaigua, and the Town of Gorham, along with the Canandaigua Lake Watershed Council, are looking at ways to improve snowplow operations. So they purchased live edge plows, and they're looking at figuring out ways to take advantage of those and calibrate their systems and maybe reduce the amount of salt while leaving the level of service the same or even better. We're not going to be able to buy a live edge plow for everybody, but in this case, the Department of State did help fund some to get started, and those lessons, once they're learned, will be shared around the state. So again, possibilities. INCON, the Department of Environmental Conservation, has funds. How many of you, I'm going to lower everybody's hands again. How many of you have gotten funds through one of the DEC's funding sources? We've got 1, 2, 3, 5, a whole bunch of you actually. Yeah. So there's actually funds for dealing with projects that are environmentally related. Water and sewer is not just the only thing. You got wetlands, you've got forest issues. There's also funds available from the Department of Health for water and sewer systems. If nothing else, there's some training funds. There's funds for the Parks and Rec. Okay. Might be a rail trail. It might even be some improvements, buying equipment, things like that. So again, don't limit yourself to just highway, even though we're talking highway. Look at your whole municipality, and there are possible other sources of funding and state aid. So if somebody wants to throw something into the Q&A, have they got money from a different state agency than Department of State, Transportation, which we're already talked about, Environmental Conservation, Health, or Parks and Rec? And someone did put in Water and Sewer Loan Fund. That's done through, I think that was the Department of Health. But there are loan funds out there. We'll actually talk a little about loans. They're a pretty cool idea. Okay. But think about other sources. And again, I'll give you some resources when we're done. Okay. Now let's switch to federal aid. There's a huge amount of federal aid out there. So everybody's going, okay, let's go get federal aid. So what are some sources of federal aid? This is a poll EV question, or again, if you can't get in the poll EV, you can throw it in the Q&A. The TIP. The TIP is this Transportation Improvement Program, or actually the statewide Transportation Improvement Program. That's where the highway funds have to be placed before they're sent back out to people. But the actual funds come from a federal program, okay? RAISE, somebody has mentioned. Yep, that's one. I'll talk about RAISE. ARPA was an old program that had funds in it, absolutely. There's FEMA, Bridge New York. Again, the bridge side is federal, okay? So you can see people are putting in things that I'm not even sure the acronyms. I know FEMA. There's the Inflation Reduction Act. There's funds out there for doing all kinds of different things. Public assistance after disasters, EPA funding for cleaning up Superfund sites and rural development. Yep. So there's actually quite a bit of federal aid out there. And some of them are short-term, have a time limit like the American Recovery Act. Some of them theoretically, like transportation funding, could keep going on. There's funding through the National Resource Council, things like that, okay? So again, we'll come back to this in a bit, so keep putting your answers in. But let's talk about a few of these projects as we go along. So there's the Surface Transportation Program, which is a big federal program targeted at the higher volume roads, but it's still eligible for bridges and safety work. There's Transportation Alternatives Program, or TAP, which is where Safe Routes to School has wound up, and some of the rail trail monies go there. There's congestion mitigation and air quality improvement. Everybody calls it CMAQ, okay? There's Tiger funds. These are for economic recovery. There's, of course, Bridge New York, which, as I said, if it's over 20 feet, it's the federal side. If it's under, it's on technically state funds, and there's processes for that. What happens is those people put in their recommendations, and then they get added to the system, and of course the state's Transportation Improvement Program. HSIP, which is Highway Safety Improvements. The nice thing about the safety funds, a lot of times safety funds get funded at a higher rate. Most federal funds are at 80-20. 80% federal, 20% local, and sometimes the state will kick in a little bit, like in the case of bridges with Marcia Shelley, they'll kick in as much as 15%. So the local share goes down. But in all these cases, it's still a pretty good deal if you can get the funding, which is competitive. So be aware of that fact, but something to think about. And of course, with the new bill that came out, there are tons of new processes that have come around because of the bipartisan infrastructure law or the IIJA. Something to keep in mind. These are 5 programs out of 25 infrastructure funding programs that are available through bill. Some of them, by the way, are for water and sewer and other infrastructure, because it is infrastructure is the bill's total name, even though it's focused a little bit more on transportation. But you know, there's RAISE, which actually stands for Those Who Care, Rebuilding American Infrastructure, Sustainability, and Equitability. And the acronym department was working hard on that particular one. There's Infrastructure for Rebuilding America, INFRA, Safe Streets for Roads for All. That's a really important source. And by the way, every road in the country is eligible for those funds. There is nobody who's not eligible for Safe Streets and Roads for All funds. Again, it's competitive, but if you've got a safety improvement, think about it, because you might be eligible for a pot of money. So it's worth looking into. And then there's rural surface transportation and reconnecting communities. These are the 5 that are the most critical in terms of highway, and some of the ones I think are most valuable for local agencies, but there's actually quite a bit out there. And they can be used for large projects, small projects. Here's an example. They just released some of the reconnecting communities grants. They just released a large pot of money for reconnecting over the top of what used to be the Humboldt Parkway, and now is the Kensington Expressway going into Buffalo. And it illustrates at a very important point. This particular project is going to cost $1 billion. That grant to help cover back over so that we can restitch back together the communities that were split apart by putting in the Kensington is only going to be $150 million out of that $1 billion grant. So it's really, 55 million. Got to look at my notes here. It's only 55 million. So it's a pretty small percentage, 5%. But that 5% or 10% or 20% that you get via a grant can help stretch your dollars to do things above and beyond what you can afford. So definitely worth looking into. Now, just because I'm curious, how many federal aid projects have you completed? Just, pop in there. 1, 0, 3, 4. If you've done none, there's a spot for you. Somebody's done 9. Ooh, almost an expert. And there is a spot down here where, oops, go back here. I have to go to the main screen here. Where did I find my mouse? There we go. There's a spot for 10 plus. So quite a few of you have done 10 plus. Okay. So you're probably pretty familiar with the process. Okay. And about the same number have done none. Okay. Not atypical. So it tends to be a bit of a inverse curve there. Not surprising. Okay. So just to keep that in mind, just one thing to remember: when most local federal aid, most of it, not all, but most of it, it's a reimbursement program. Unlike CHIPS, it's not done every single year. It's a reimbursement program. It's a grant-based program. Okay. And one of the things you have to do is you have to get authorizations before you move from step to step to step. So the local federal aid process, we had a webinar, a workshop actually, 4 hours last week, and we'll be doing it again this fall. It's very important to understand the process because it is a little more complicated than like CHIPS or EWR, state funding. Okay. But it's available. Now, this actually is this DOT's project development process, not the federal process, but illustrates something. When you start getting into bigger and bigger projects or federal aid, there's a lot of steps involved, and it's like the game of life. Now, you're probably going, the font's too small, I can't read it. I know, it's just an illustration. Really, another way to think about it is look at it from the standpoint of any project you're doing. You're going to have a planning phase, you're going to scope out the project, you're looking for funding at that period of time during the planning and scoping phase. You're then going to design it, you're going to build it, and then you're going to maintain it. And each step is important. And you definitely want to know that before you go ask for funding, how much money it's really going to cost, and do you have a realistic estimate? And yes, we'll come back to that here at the end of our hour together. Now, when it comes to federal aid, it really matters what functional system you're on. The arterials, principal arterials, are going to get the lion's share of the funds because that's the primary role of the federal dollars, is to maintain the national highway system. So principal arterials, in this case, green here in the city of Ithaca, Route 13 going around the city, Route 79 coming in from the east, those are the principal arterials. They're the ones that are going to have the most funds. The minor arterials are going to be next, okay? So this is going to be the red roads in this particular case, okay? And then, of course, there's going to be collector roads that are in there, okay? Most of our county roads are collectors, but not all. Some of them are minor arterials. And then, of course, if it's not listed, it's a local road. And so people go, well, if I'm on a local road, how am I going to compete? Well, some of the funds, like the Surface Transportation Program, yeah, it's going to be very hard for you to compete. But bridge monies, safety monies, every road is eligible. But you got to have a plan. Having a plan, having a good grant makes a huge difference in terms of being able to get those funds. And we'll talk about that to end our hour up together. Now, there is functional classifications on very low volume roads, and sometimes I hear people say, well, they're never going to be eligible because when you look at it from the standpoint of traffic volumes, they're just such low traffic volumes. But if there's a big bang for the buck, you'd be surprised. You might be able to get a grant. It might be a small one, but a small grant can make a big difference. Maybe buy you some safety equipment, maybe improve your traffic signals, maybe improve put in even a small mini roundabout, things like that. There are funds available even on very low volume roads. So while you might have a harder time to compete, don't shortchange yourself, but also be sure you know what is eligible before you apply. No point in putting the effort in if you're not going to be eligible. So let's just put up 5 different projects and see what you guys think. Which would be federally eligible? Bridge replacement on a local road, new sidewalks to a school, rehab of a low volume road, safety improvements in an intersection, or signal replacement at the mall. You can vote for all 5 or you can vote for none. Let's see what you guys think. And if you can't answer the poll EV, you can throw it in the Q&A. And yes, the bridge replacement is always eligible. And I wish they would tell me the percentage of people who voted, but they break it down by overall percentage. Okay, so looks like most of you are putting in bridge replacement and safety improvements. And that's true. They're always going to be eligible. Okay. New sidewalks to a school very much could be. Okay. That's where Safe Routes to School program used to be. It's now into the Transportation Alternatives program. Again, but you need to show the value of safety, depending on the grant, where the funds are coming from, makes a big difference. Rehab of a low volume road, that's going to be tough. How you're going to need to show how your need for the federal or state funds are something that would be even competitive. Very unlikely that that would get federal funding unless there's a safety improvement involved with it, unless there's some overall, it's part of the national highway system. There are some surprising roads in the national highway system that are low volume, but it's probably not going to be as eligible. And signal replacement at the mall, interestingly enough, you might actually want the private people to be paying for those things. When we talk about other sources of funding, that's something you can do. If a business wants to come in, there's ways for them to pay for those improvements. But if it's an overall safety improvement, maybe in a corridor or an intersection, there may be ways to get some federal dollars to stretch existing local or even private funds on a particular project. So think about ways you can stretch the dollars and get a grant. So easy to remember, bridges and safety are always going to be eligible, but you're going to have to just be competitive. Okay. Now, what other grants have you gotten? Not federal, not state, not local dollars, but where else might you go to find funds to pay for things? Anybody done that? Got money that wasn't from another government? National Grid, yeah, the private utility company might want to do some upgrades. Maybe you can work with them. Some colleges, that's what these pilots we talked about comes in play. Okay, payments in lieu of taxes. Or they might do a grant because they're looking at doing a research project and they need a local partner and they might be able to help you with something. We've done that in a couple of cases with some small projects to help fund some things. Yep. So think about the businesses and the companies and the organizations you deal with. If they want improvements, maybe you could help them fund things. There are grants from NGOs, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits who are trying to do things. You might be able to work with them to do grants to improve route to a school or maybe help put up something for the library. So look for those things. The VA's federal, but that's a good thought. Again, don't shortchange yourself. Think about ways to get funding. You might be surprised. There's probably more out there than you realize. Okay, so something to keep in mind as we're moving forward. How do we fund things? Micron, I know, has funded some things from private companies. Yeah. And I didn't mention them, but there are the authorities that are out there. There's the Power Authority. There's the New York State Thruway Authority. When you intersect with them, they would probably fall under that other category. Just something to keep in mind. Yeah, and the Port Authority downstate. Absolutely. So let's talk about bonds. Well, not this bond. And by the way, this is James Bond, him and Lazenby, but nobody remembers Lazenby. But let's talk a little bit about alternative sources of not funding or revenue, excuse me, but to pay for projects. You can put out bonds to take a project that's just too big for your municipality, and you can spread those costs out via bonds. That's a lot of the ways the federal government was funded for many, many years before there were many taxes, was through the issuance of bonds. You can lease things. Equipment is the most common, but you can lease things. You can even lease buildings. Some of the state's buildings in Albany are actually leased to help spread those costs out and to have a little more control on the finances. you can set up capital reserve funds. And these are actually tools that most agencies should be using, but most of us aren't. So let's go back to our raising hand function. How many of you have a capital reserve that you're using right now? There's a few of you. Okay. And if you wouldn't mind, can you throw in the Q&A what you're using that capital reserve for? Let's see what you put in there. What are you using your capital reserve for? Helping balance the budget, possibly, yeah. Signal improvement project. So you got too many signals, you're just going to have a hard time paying for them. So you put that in. Equipment is a fairly common one. Okay. You can use capital reserves to help spread that cost out so that if you've only got, say, $200,000 in your equipment fund on an annual basis, but we know that a new snowplow with all the accoutrement is going to cost you $300,000, you could use a capital equipment fund to help spread those costs out. So in some years you spend less and then you buy your big plow, and then other years you spend less and you build that reserve fund up. And yes, you can use it for bridges and culverts, and there's different ways. There are other ways for municipalities to essentially raise funds for big projects beyond even grants with their local financing. And it's something that, think about those instruments. They're actually pretty valuable, and talk to the folks who are the treasurers and the comptrollers within your agencies. A good way to think about it, though, is what would be worth going out and doing that financing, because there is a cost to money. Borrowing is not always the best option. So I've got you 5 things that are typical things you might have to pay for. Which ones would you pay for with a loan? A dinner, a wedding, work boots, your utility bill, or a new bathroom? Okay. And I purposely use the word loan, and I'm going to remind you of something in just a sec. Okay, so nobody would pay for dinner with a loan. A few of you might pay for the work boots, but the bathroom and the wedding, I hope the utility bill isn't so big that you have to take out a loan, because think about it, it's every single month. And if it's every single month, do you really want to be taking out a loan? Okay. So let's keep that in mind for larger projects. And by the way, if you're using a credit card and you don't pay that bill at the end of the month, you're actually doing a form of a loan. It's a short-term one, but you're paying interest to somebody else. And that's really the value of money. So think about, even if you are using your credit card to pay for dinner, you don't want to leave that on the credit card bill. You got to pay it off. Are there exceptions? I've had dinners that I knew stretched my finances because they were nice and fancy, but you pay the bills off when you can. So let's look at a couple of highway related things, or even public works things. Which one of these would need to be financed? And I don't know why this is still in here. I'm going to clear this. I apologize. I'm going to make you redo this. Okay, so which ones would need to be financed? Dump trucks, chip seals, rail to trail conversions, tools for the shop, and a new salt barn. Which one of these would you want to finance with some form of financing, whether it's a capital reserve fund, going out and getting a grant from the federal or state government, working with an NGO? Which one would you finance? Okay. And interest, just what I expected. Nobody's going to finance your shop tools. Okay. But maybe you have insurance to help cover in case of loss. You may still want to carry some insurance in case of loss, but what's the deductible amount? You're probably not going to do chip seals. But again, a rail to trail conversion. Is it short? Is it sweet? Yeah, you may not need to finance it. Dump trucks, how many do you have? If you're replacing one every single year, do you just want to set up your budget so you pay for one every single year if you're a bigger agency? Or do you want to finance those? And by the way, sometimes you may still want to finance them, even if you're buying them. Use bonds. People like to actually sometimes purposely do that. But again, if you take out a bond, make sure you're paying off the principal. You don't want to just keep that interest building up. You eventually want to cause those bonds to go back to zero. Okay. And a new salt barn, a big structure. Yeah, something to keep in mind. Okay. So what do we do next? Let's spend our last 10 minutes together talking about what do we do next. Okay. Now, some sources of revenue is annual, like chips. You're going to get chips as long as you can document that you're doing work that has a 10-year life. You'll get chips and its related kin doing certain paperwork. Okay. Other items that you need to go get funding for, you're going to have to get them included in the state transportation improvement plan. Okay. Now, some of them are defaults. They're actually available on a regular basis. The state has some funds in that particular area. But a lot of these things are competitive. Even if they get put into the transportation plan before they're actually spent, you actually apply for them and then you're essentially defaulted into the STIP. Or they might even be, with some of the new stuff coming out of bill, direct aid. You'll get aid directly from the federal government and it would not actually be part of the STIP. By the way, they don't have the rules completely written for all of this yet. So watch this space. If you're applying for one of those direct aid grants, I think there's going to be some things going to watch carefully on that. But whatever you're doing, you want to go out, you want to seek funding. And the thing I want to make sure everybody understands, when you're going out to seek funding from anybody, even in your own funds, make sure you've got a realistic schedule and a realistic budget. Don't shortchange yourself, especially if you're going out and getting federal or state aid, because once you get that grant, if the scope changes, if they ask for extra work, you're going to have to cover that with local funds. It's very unlikely they're going to be able to increase the amount of money that's available. So have a realistic schedule and a realistic budget. The two places I would send anybody, and you'll hear the term NOFO. This is not FOMO, fear of missing out. This is NOFO. It's a notice of funding opportunities. And the two I would go to, they're in your handout, but I'll put them up on screen. The federal one is www.grants.gov, and the state one is grantsmanagement.ny.gov. And again, you don't need to write these down. They're in the handout. And again, go open up your folder, and we'll email you a copy of the handout anyway. Right, Amanda? I'll watch for Amanda. Just give me a thumbs up here. Yep, she'll send you a copy. So you'll have the link. You don't have to write these down, but those are two really critical ones. And you can actually, for both of them, log in and you'll get a daily list of available grant funding source opportunities. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So what do? Well, think about, is the grant process worth the revenue? Now, that's actually a question we don't always ask, but it's really important. There's more hoops with a federal program. There's more hoops even with a state program. Is it worth it? Okay. At the end of it, can you maintain it? And by the way, could you change the design so you can maintain it? You know, that's actually, I've seen that happen. That's happened here at Cornell, where they built a building and they didn't have the financing to maintain it. And that created some crises. So can you maintain it once it gets built? If you put in a trail, who's going to maintain it? How are you going to maintain it? And then, of course, where do I get help? You can, of course, talk to us, but I would start talking to your neighbors, your colleagues. If you're talking with the state, talk to the regional planning liaisons down at the close office. Go get help. Go talk to people. And just as an illustration, how does it take you to go from project inception to construction? We're not talking a chip seal. We're talking a major, capital project. And people are putting in 1 to 2, 3 to 4, and a few more than 5 years. So we aren't looking at 2023. If you're starting to think about federal aid, you need to be looking at 2024, 2025, or even further out. So you've got to have a long range plan in place. And of course, some projects are going to take longer. Federal aid projects do take longer because of those extra steps. So you probably have to add an additional 10, 20%, hopefully not more than that. Okay. But keep that in mind. What's the timeline? Be thinking further out than most of us think. Okay. Now I'm going to end with a couple of quick examples to illustrate some federal aid that we got sent to us by the state DOT, just to illustrate some fun things and how aid can help. Here's a case where a railroad company, Conrail, worked with the county to pay for a new bridge. Okay. It was federal funds, about 80%. There were state funds, local funds. Interestingly enough, the locals only paid 1%, and Conrail didn't pay anything. Okay. Now, there was some in-house time for both agencies, but the cash outlay was surprisingly small for both of those, and they got a new bridge. Here's an example of a safety improvement where it was, again, mostly federal, little state, the locals paid about 6%. Safety improvements usually are fairly well funded and definitely something to think about. But you can pay for other things. Here's a railroad station, an old restoration that's part of a rail trail project. Okay. Now, in this case, the locals did pay a little bit more, about 33%, a third, but they saved an old historic structure and everybody gets a benefit out of it. The city of Buffalo rebuilt Niagara Street. Okay. And it's a sustainable corridor project. In this case, the locals actually were already doing work. So they wound up spending 2/3 of the cost with local funds. But those federal dollars enhanced it, allowed it to add in bridge bike lanes and markings and crossings that they probably would not have been able to do otherwise. So look for ways to stretch the dollars. And that's actually a very good way to get a grant, be successful as well. Rail to trail is a fairly common thing. We've seen a lot of those. And of course, I don't want to forget, even simple safety programs that are dealing with ADA and stuff, definitely worthwhile to look into. Okay. So a couple of last ideas. First, have a plan. Okay. Know what you'd like to have. But have a plan that's going to be one you're happy with at the end of it, unlike our stop sign here, which is white in the day and barely legible at night. And go get help. Talk to the state, talk to your MPO if you're part of an MPO, talk to the Federal Highway Administration or your federal partners. And remember, most of these programs are reimbursements. So do you have the finances, the cash, and do you have the staff to maintain the grant during its life? And can you maintain it afterwards? Okay. Keep those things in mind. You'll have a good day, but hopefully we've gave you some ideas. Hope to see you on Thursday for grant writing. So you can start thinking about how to write that grant to get those funds. We have one more of our webinars coming up next week on erosion and ditches. And then, as I said, we're going to be doing our spring workshops, and we are doing our budgeting workshops. So we hope to see you out there in 3 places, but everything else is on the table as well. And to find all of this and get more information, go to our website, just NYSLTAP-CLRP Cornell EDU, or search for that. Google's real good at that, or you can email us at our root CLRP email, or you can email me directly at david.org. Both are cornell.edu addresses. With that, everybody have yourself a great day, and we will see you on the web and hopefully see you in person during the spring. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.